The reading from the textbook is, oh, that looks like I didn't start yet. Welcome back to week 3, everyone. So this week I want to globalize our discussion of revolutions from last week. The reading from the textbook is short, but there's a lot in it, and I've also got 2 incredibly important documents for you to peruse. So as always, please reach out to me if anything isn't making sense with regards to the readings, discussion board posts, focus questions, whatever. So in this slide that you're looking at, this is my introductory slide, the building on the left is the Haitian National Palace, which unfortunately isn't there anymore. It was a victim of the 2010 earthquake. The structure in the middle is the entrance to the headquarters of the old Sokoto Caliphate in Nigeria, and the statue on the right is one of Simon Bolivar, who happens to be, this statue happens to be in Washington, D.C., though there are similar statues of him all over the Western Hemisphere. The dude's even got a country named after him. Bolivia. These buildings or statues are all legacies of revolutions that came in the wake of the American and French revolutions, and they all were reactions to the emergence of the modern world. All of these revolutions have ramifications that still matter to this day. So let me see if I, it's always so hard to switch slides. All right, where do I put myself? I'll put myself right here with the rights of man. So one of the primary documents that I alluded to last week was the Declaration on the Rights of Man and Citizen. This document in and of itself was part of an act of rebellion. It's one of the first things drafted by the new assembly in Paris in August of 1789. Like the American Declaration of Independence, it's a foundational document of classical liberalism. Its ideas are incorporated into constitutions all around the world. It's certainly incorporated into the Charter of the United Nations as well. It came out 1 month before our American Bill of Rights as well, and both documents have very similar ideas. One of my focus questions for this week asks you to think about the relevance of one of the articles of the Declaration of the Rights of Man and Citizen. The other primary source that I gave you is the Declaration on the Rights of Woman. This was never ratified by the Assembly and was written more as a joke, but a very serious joke, highlighting the hypocrisy of the revolution. Its author, the activist and actor Olympe de Gouges, would ultimately be put on trial by the Committee for Public Safety for being an unnatural woman. She was especially bitter given the key role women had played in making the revolution happen at all. It was in salons, private meeting places basically, where women brought people together to get talking about the ideas of liberalism to begin with. It was women who led so many of the bread riots, including the storming of the Bastille. So Degaugier wondered why none of the rights they had fought for applied to them. And this document, which has some cheeky elements in it, it's got very serious rights discussed as well, and certainly is foundational for more modern feminism. So as you look over her document, I want you, for your focus question, to think seriously about why women's rights need to be guaranteed in order for there to be any rights at all. There would be decades, centuries really, of women after her trying to continue this struggle. So the next slide, come on. This is one that you saw, or I want to cover Louverture, there we go. So that you saw this slide last week, and I just want to repeat how incredibly important the Haitian Revolution was to inspiring activists against slavery and to inspiring revolutions all over the Western Hemisphere and by default all over the world. So and it should be inspiring to humanity as a whole. Just the story of mostly illiterate slaves taking control of their own destinies and forming a republic. Haiti is amazing. So one person who gained direct inspiration. Oh yeah. Where did everything go? Here, can I be a libertador? I'll be down here with the lucha anti-imperialista. So one person who gained direct inspiration from Haiti, as well as his contact with Napoleon and other French revolutionaries, was Simon Bolivar. He was a nobleman and slave owner from Caracas, and after becoming converted to revolutionary ideology, he freed his slaves and became a military leader, fighting for independence from Spain across Central and South America. The guy is a rock star in the history of South and Central America. He's rightly had lots of movies made about his life, most of which are in my Netflix queue. I don't really get around to watching them. But one of the advantages he had was that Spain was rather weak at administering its colonies after Napoleon's invasion of Spain in 1807, the Peninsular War, the peninsula being the Iberian Peninsula. The majority of your reading for this week deals with Spanish colonies in the New World in the aftermath of Napoleon's attack on their home country. So, one of Bolivar's goals was to unify. Gotta have my face somewhere. It's hard to concentrate without my face. Uh, was to unify the Spanish-speaking colonies into a republic inspired by the United States of America, among others. His Gran Colombia would last for only 10 years, and this is a map of what it looks like. And you've got a little bit of reading about it, maybe 2 pages. And this shows how fragile experiments in creating federations can be. That the fact that the United States was able to combine, survive a brutal war over slavery, and still stick together is really an aberration in world history rather than a norm. And every time we have some act of civic coming together, like voting, which we'll all do in November, if I haven't said this to you yet, if you vote this November, you get 5 extra credit points on the first paper. If you are ineligible to vote for whatever reason, if you give me your word that you will vote whenever you become eligible and do everything within your power to become eligible to vote here in the US, if you're a citizen of another country, if you vote in your home country, whatever. If you make an effort to vote and do vote, if you're registered, I will give you 5 extra credit points on the first paper. So, anyways, every time we have an act like this of civic coming together, it's sometimes we take it for granted that our country is just going to last. Well, I mean, looking at federations like the United States of America throughout history, we should realize that we really are more of an aberration. And so Gran Colombia would only last 10 years. There are certainly many Spanish speakers across Latin America who would like to see closer political cooperation in the Americas, but elites have often resented any loss of their own power to supranational authorities. We see that at the European Union right now. And, so this one fell apart, and I have a focus question about why you think it did. So let me move on. Okay, so I hope this flag in this picture shocks you. It's a picture from 2012 of Brazilian Confederates who are celebrating their heritage as descendants of Confederate landowners who fled to Brazil in 1865 with their slaves after the Union victory. Brazil welcomed them as their government didn't abolish slavery until 1888. By the way, Brazilians, today they get just as annoyed by this flag as Americans do, though it also has its defenders in Brazil, like these guys in their little army costumes, who say stuff that, it's not hatred, it's just part of their heritage. So that heritage in both countries involved violence in support of enslaving other people. So how did Brazil get to be that way in the 1800s? Get to be such a staunch defender of slavery that when slavery ended in the United States of America, this was a haven for people to come to. So Brazil, like so many Spanish colonies, Brazil wasn't Spanish, it's Portuguese, that's the language they speak today, also revolted after Napoleon's invasion. The difference is that Brazilians were hosting the royal family of Portugal at the time, and they fled there. So imagine just for a second, like how different the American Revolution might have gone down if King George III was a house guest of the Continental Congress when we declared our independence. So the Brazilians basically said, we've got a country right now, and you don't, so we'll still keep you as our king, but we're going to do our own thing. And they became fully autonomous after 1822 and established a republic that was explicitly a republic for slaveholders, with far fewer compromises than the American Constitution had to try and guarantee rights. So Brazil had been a force of conservatism fighting against Bolivar even before this, and it continued to be a conservative force in favor of slavery as revolutions swirled along its borders. They were the last country in the Western Hemisphere to officially abolish slavery as well, not until 1888. So I want to make sure that we have a little bit of a discussion of Mexico as well, as its independence both diverged from, and so Mexico is outside of the realm of Bolivar, but Its independence diverged from and dovetailed with movements in the rest of the Americas. One of the big differences Mexico had compared to the other revolutions we've discussed so far was the nature of its people. Mexico was and still is the most populous Spanish speaking country in the Western Hemisphere, but unlike the English speaking colonies to the north, where populations polarized between the enslaved and, the patriarchies of free white smallholders, Mexico was largely made up of peasants. To be sure, there were slaves. Slavery had a history among Mesoamerican peoples, and African slavery had been practiced there for 100 years before the first African slaves even came to Jamestown. But slavery didn't as easily take root in Mexico. For starters, Mexico's big, and there weren't a lot of Spaniards there. So it was very easy to escape, especially into the jungles in the south, where the most lucrative plantation crops could be grown. So 1 year before the first slaves were auctioned off at Jamestown, Spanish authorities in Mexico actually signed a treaty recognizing the rights of runaways or maroon slave settlements. By the time Mexico gained its independence, African slavery had largely died out naturally. Mexicans outlawed the slave trade in 1817 and completely abolished it in 1829. Mexican opposition to slavery was the prime sticking point with Anglo American settlers in Texas who wanted to bring their slaves along, leading to the Texas War for Independence from Mexico, or the Mexican War to stop Texas slavery. So by the time of the Napoleonic Wars, Mexico was a large series of interlocking feudal style estates where people took pride in a mestizo identity, basically a mixing of European and native DNA. Uh, People, or they would have said blood at the time. So people had an identity of class based unity in opposition to the largely European landowners and wealthy elites. As the Napoleonic Wars continued to bog down Spanish imperial authorities, on September 16, 1810, a priest named Miguel Hidalgo y Costilla rang the church bell in Guanajuato and shouted the cry of Dolores, where he beckoned to Mexican nationalism and the rights of peasants to not be oppressed by foreign overlords. Over the next decade, Mexico won autonomy, then independence from Spain, which eventually realized it was too costly to try and retake Mexico. So, when describing France last week, I mentioned tension between religion and the revolution. In the United States, what developed in the Young Republic was the abolishment of state sponsored churches and total separation of church and state, which allowed religions to become stronger and more vibrant as they focused on the spiritual realm. What happened in Mexico was that the church, or at least many priests close to the people, became active promoters of revolution, making Catholicism a key marker of identity as the state became independent. So let's switch continents now. I love these two maps. Um, they show you how West Africa has changed, politically at least, over the past 500 years. So for much of West African history, its main political units looked a lot like the one on the left. The Ghana, the Mali, the Songhai empires, they all kind of looked like this. They existed along the Niger River and controlled trade going across the Sahara, so they had important port cities that basically faced the Sahara, which is, where they had a connection to the rest of the world. Uh, so to the south, you had smaller political units that, at least on this map, don't even exist. They existed. There have always been people there. And they traded and fought with the empires to the north. So by the time the Portuguese figured out how to sail against the West African winds and lack of winds, really, the doldrums, the nexus of trade for West Africa would shift from the Sahara to the Atlantic. So by the 1700s, the most powerful West African kingdoms were along the Atlantic Ocean. And so already by the 1700s, Africa would look more like this second map, some of which would become the cores of independent countries that you see today. So today, the bulk of West Africa's population is close to the ocean, while the arid regions of the north, uh, this area of West Africa, which were once the trade centers of antiquity, are no more. They're far more lightly populated. I mean, Mali, for instance, has a total of 19 million people. Niger has 21 million, compared to 20 million each in the tiny countries of Togo and Benin, or a whopping 200 million people in Nigeria. Timbuktu, which for millennia had been one of the most important cities in West Africa, or Geni Geno. Like Timbuktu has 50,000 people today, whereas Accra is, I don't know the population off the top of my head, but it's one of the largest cities in the world, multiple millions. So, oh, sorry, Accra over here. Lagos. I mixed up Lagos and Accra. Whoops. All right. So before getting to Lagos is the biggest city, one of the biggest cities in the world. So before getting to the Fulani Jihad and the role of Usman Dan Fodio as a background to a little more of broadening the revolution, I want to briefly cover about 1,000 years of Islamic history in West Africa. It's easy to do because despite a rich tradition of believers, for 1,000 years, Islam never really took root in West Africa, in large part because of slavery. This is my own hypothesis. So for a long time, Islam had a troubling relationship with slavery, much like Christianity did. Both religions were based on peace, love, devotion to God, service towards others. Both at their core are completely incompatible with something like slavery. But both of these religious traditions emerged in a world where slavery was normal. And in places like the Pauline epistles of the New Testament and certain passages in the Quran, the very fact that slaves are mentioned was used as justification, even though the gospel of Jesus Christ and the revelations to the Prophet Muhammad leave absolutely no room for slavery. So the fact that both Christians and Muslims came up with really cockamamie justifications for slavery made it difficult for ordinary people to accept these religions in areas where people sought slaves to capture. Like this is basically my hypothesis here is that West Africans did not embrace Islam because they saw it as a hypocritical religion. Um, so the Ghana, Mali, Songhai empires were all Islamic and were for hundreds of years, but few people around them accepted a religion of peace that hypocritically allowed for slavery. That was until the emergence of Danfodio's Fulani Jihad that opposed the power of empires that were complicit in slave trading and began to advocate for a more pure devotion to Islam. Over the course of the 19th century, then, people converted to Islam in droves in West Africa, and it became a dominant religion in the northern tier of Western Africa, in large part because people practiced sincere devotion to Islam. Christianity would later take root in the southern tier of West Africa, for the most part after the end of colonialism. And the Christianity of West Africa today has a freshness and a level of devotion that often exceeds that in the rest of the world, in large part because of its sincerity derived from its newness. And that's not to say that Christianity also hasn't been in West Africa since basically the beginning of Christianity. Certainly it was in East Africa. So I put up pictures on this slide that uh, are try to modernize the topic a bit. I wanted to point out that the extremist group Boko Haram claims to follow the legacy of the Fulani Jihad. Most Africans reject them, and since 2015, Nigerian efforts to defeat Boko Haram, as celebrated in this billboard, which I believe this billboard is from 2016, have helped to unify Christians and Muslims. Nigeria is split roughly 50-50 between Christians and Muslims. Hopefully, they can be an example to people in other parts of the world dealing with religious tension between the world's two largest religious traditions. And then to the right here, there's a beautiful mosque in Lagos, not Accra, Lagos. Okay, so I mentioned Don Fodio in the previous slide. And Usman Dan Fodio, I should tell his story a little more. He was an Islamic scholar from the Kanem region of what is today Nigeria. And he preached against the poor adherence to Islam among people in his region, especially un-Islamic activities like adultery, drinking alcohol, gambling. In 1804, he inspired a military and spiritual jihad that succeeded in cementing political and spiritual control over a vast swath of northern West Africa. And I want to point to this history as just another example of revolutionary activities in response to the emergence of the modern world. So West Africa is completely destabilized from the excesses of the slave trade, the excesses of early colonialism. And one method that is resisted is to hark back to traditional Islamic values Well, the thing is that they weren't traditional Islamic values for the majority of the population. But because of the sincerity, because of, I mean, the extreme intelligence of this person in particular, as well as the desire to, find meaning in a world that didn't make any sense, you had people convert to Islam to the point that to this day, this region of West Africa is majority Islamic. And, by the 1850s, it would stretch all the way to the coasts of Senegal and Gambia, which, the Senegambian region had also long been Islamic, but not really. So for my final slide, I want to jump back to Europe and look at another one of these ideas that helped people to make sense of a world that was changing all around them. It's romantic nationalism. So last week we talked about nationalism as one of the modern ideas that emerged in the wake of the French Revolution. One of the areas of Europe where it was strongest by the middle of the century was among Slavs and German speakers. German speakers in particular were divided among numerous principalities in what had been the Holy Roman Empire, as well as outside states like Habsburg, Austria, Switzerland, and Germans were scattered in small settlements across Central, Southern, and Eastern Europe. There are German settlements all the way to the Volga River in Russia. So one of the ideas that emerged among these people was that you could be more free, could realize your aspirations as a person more fully if you could join yourself to a nation of like minded people with a similar language, similar ethnic origin, culture, food, stories, etc. etc. Pronounce etc. weird. So Johann Gottfried Herder, he was one of the big thinkers who hoped that, if people could have republican forms of government like the French or like the Americans and be unified into nation states, that there would be world peace. A nation state meaning a country where everyone is of the same nationality, the same ethnicity. So the problem in Europe and most of the world, of course, is that when you try to have pure ethno-national spaces, you end up having people who nationalists imagine as not belonging. The aspiration to have pure national spaces would lead to some of the worst crimes against humanity in history, and they're ongoing in some parts of the world, like Myanmar, as I'm speaking. So on this slide, I've also got the Brothers Grimm, who you've probably heard of before. They believe that recording the folklores and stories of ethnic Germans would help create a canon of literature upon which they could base a better understanding of German identity. So, nationalism. That is my whirlwind tour of some highlights of revolutions. We're going to continue this. And for the bonus questions this week, I left that they're a little bit open-ended, but hopefully as easy and quick as they've been for the previous 2 weeks. So good luck on the bonus questions below. And as always, please reach out to me if you have any questions. Thank you.